I realise I should have specified that I'm talking specifically about the Orthodox Christian liturgical tradition. It's very striking, even despite being quite familiar with a lot of Margaret Barker's writing. I was still struck by the degree of congruence between the sorts of things that she was talking about this morning, coming from the temple liturgy, and the sorts of things that I'm going to talk about, and others that one could talk about in the Orthodox tradition. Two things that struck me particularly, one which I mentioned, the congruence with the imagery that Maximus the Confessor uses. I wish I should have included that on the handout. Sorry, I didn't think of it. But his mystagogy starts with several chapters talking about the senses in which the church is a world and the world is a church, uniting visible and invisible and with God at the centre. And it's this vision that has given rise to the phrase cosmic liturgy, which, contrary to what sometimes said, is not Maximus's phrase. It's the phrase from Hans Urs von Balthasar. But it's something that has been picked up by a number of Orthodox writers. It strikes a chord as a very appropriate way of talking. The other thing that really struck me in Margaret's presentation is this wonderful image that if we have our back to God, if we have our back to the east window, we're looking at everything through our own shadow, through a human shadow. And this struck me because it was actually, I hadn't thought of that image, but the way I always want to characterize the vision I am talking about is precisely of creation as a reality all facing in the same direction, all orientated towards God. That doesn't mean to say that it's everything has the same function, but it's all of us creatures relating to our Creator. The question which environmental theology so often gets caught up on, tilling and keeping the earth in a rather literal interpretation, that is a cosmic sideshow. It's important, but it's on a secondary level. It is contained with the primary reality that we are all part of the same thing, facing in the same direction. And that is indeed the image that we get from cosmic liturgy. And this language of cosmic liturgy, of course, raises the question, what does it actually mean? What does it really amount to? Is it just a figure of speech, or does it give us a real insight into the way creation works? And certainly I'm going to claim the latter. There's quite a popular literature now of the secret lives of this and that, plants, trees. Well, in a sense, this is the secret life of the elements and non-human creation in general. If we're talking about a liturgical or worshipping cosmos, an obvious place to start looking is human worship, liturgical texts. And there are a number of passages in the liturgical texts where we hear explicitly about the cosmos, that's the non-human visible creation. Not as many as there used to be. In earlier usage, there are anaphora prayers, some of which are very explicit. We'll talk about them later, and you've got them on the handout. In contemporary usage, we find sources often in Vespers and Matins, not in Eucharistic liturgy, and above all, the material comes from the Psalms. And one thing this reminds us is the importance of the Psalms in Christian worship, certainly Orthodox worship, also more widely. And in fact, if we forget that Christian worship is to a large extent supplementary to the Psalms, if we forget that, the whole balance of the service is skewed. There's a functional element which is diminished. Another text which Margaret also mentioned is the insight into cosmology from the Song of the Three Children, which most of us hear only once a year, but that was quite recently on Holy Saturday. It is, however, echoed at Matins, for those of us who manage to hear Matins every so often, in the 8th Ode of the Canon, which is based on this scriptural canticle. It's looking at liturgical texts, it's immediately apparent that their cosmological picture is rather different from what we find in patristic homilies or treatises. If we're relying on those writings, we certainly hear about the wonders of nature, and we hear about its usefulness to man in various ways, creation as God's gift. But there's actually very little about its own relationships, so to speak, to God. Liturgy, of course, is about worship, so it's not surprising that liturgical cosmology depicts nature as involved in worship, or at least responding to God. The clouds drop gladness, the mountains skip, and of course every breath praises the Lord. But again, this brings us to the question of what weight we give to this sort of expression. Some people will say, of course, this is poetry, and it's not meant to be taken literally, personifications of the elements and so forth. Or it's an instance of the pathetic fallacy. It's a device to underline certainly the importance of what's happening in human affairs, and perhaps indeed indicating that there's a genuinely cosmic dimension to what's happening, for instance, in the incarnation, when the earth and the heavens are described as rejoicing. Man's relationship with God has consequences for the whole of creation, but still, many people would say this is simply expressed in metaphorical language, and of course, it depends what you mean by metaphorical language. If you're talking about other creatures, let alone inanimate creatures, it's really impossible to avoid metaphor, because their experience, in inverted commas, isn't necessarily a figment of our imagination, but certainly it isn't fully accessible to us. But the relevant question is, why is this metaphor chosen? What reality is it conveying? Well, another way of trying to approach this question is from another area of the Church's tradition where we encounter praise from all creation, and that is mystical experience. There's a considerable body of experience over the centuries in which people perceive often the heavens and the stars and the trees glorifying God, as in the Russian classic The Way of a Pilgrim, or St. Nectarios of Aegina, again, a recent saint, died in the early 20th century, who spoke to his nuns about the grasses praising the Lord, and they asked, as we are asking, well, what does that actually mean? What do you hear? And he didn't attempt to explain, but he prayed, and the next day the nuns also were able to hear this song of praise from the grasses. One interesting feature that we see, for instance, in The Way of the Pilgrim and other visions that we'll talk about, is that often this perception of the praise of creation is connected with the Jesus prayer, and that actually brings me to another point in Margaret's presentation, which I was very struck by, the name as seal on the covenant. And if, given that the Jesus prayer is to do with the name of Jesus, the name of God incarnate, it actually seems to make quite a lot of sense that this should be the key to an understanding of how creation as a whole relates to its creator. When we talk about mystical experience, this is by definition something that isn't accessible to most people most of the time and doesn't correspond to our ordinary perception of reality. So it's easy to slip into thinking that not only the process of experiencing, but the thing experienced is somehow a private reality, something subjective. At one extreme, people might assume that it's hallucination or delusion, but without going that far, one could well consider that a particular vision has been granted to an individual with some meaning for that person, perhaps a symbolic meaning. It doesn't necessarily correspond to an objective reality. But I want to suggest that the vision of cosmic praise does correspond to an objective reality. Of course, the details in which it's perceived may vary from person to person. Yes, this is very different from the way we normally perceive the behavior of the elements, but arguably it's the capacity for perception and not the object of perception that's different in mystical experiences. And what I further want to suggest is that there's a way in which the gathered church as a whole becomes privy to that reality which is mystically perceived by a few, and that's that it is recorded in the liturgical texts. It's interesting, I think, that this connection is endorsed by Metropolitan John Zizioulas, no less, who is known for a profound suspicion of mysticism in general. But he is quite clear that the Eucharist is, as he says, the mystical experience of the Church par excellence, and furthermore associated consistently with vision, such as Isaiah's vision of God, represented in the thrice holy hymn, or the vision of the eschatological kingdom. The vision of the Apocalypse clearly has a liturgical, Eucharistic setting. And he points out that the response at the end of the Divine Liturgy is, "We have seen the true light." This is where the experience of the Eucharistic liturgy takes us. So, returning to liturgical texts, there are a few texts that have come down to us, again suggesting that experiences of cosmic praise have an objective reality, and interestingly they come from a liturgical context of some sort. There's a strange text in the apostolic tradition of Hippolytus, very early church order, which gives the following rationale for why Christians pray at midnight. Because at this hour all creation pauses for a moment to praise the Lord, and the whole host of angels that minister to him join with the spirits of the righteous in praising God. All ranks of creatures, not just rational ones, literally praise the Lord. The unusual thing about this text isn't that everything praises the Lord, but the idea that they pause from their usual activity in order to do so. More often the thinking is that their usual activity is the praise, and a comparable text in apostolic constitutions similarly speaks of creatures, the choir of stars in these early texts. Typically the stars are referred to as a choir, partly because they move as in a dance, but also with the sense that they praise. So the stars, animals and trees, in their characteristic habit and activity, are described as indicating or pointing to God, who is the source of that activity. But the conclusion is similar to Hippolytus, that every man should send up a hymn from his very soul to you through Christ in the name of all the rest, since by your appointment he rules over them. And this is a very clear example of dominion over creation, dominion over the earth, being interpreted in a priestly and liturgical sense. One of the most dramatic accounts of cosmic praise in a liturgical setting is a story attributed to Anastasius of Sinai, relating how one year when the liturgy for Pentecost was being celebrated on the mountain on Sinai, and the mountains responded at the appropriate point with holy, 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 and kept this up for half an hour. And that's also interesting, the inanimate world praises in the hymn that we associate with the angels. There is this connection between inanimate creation and the angels. And the Anastasius goes on to say that this was audible only to those with ears to hear, which leaves open the possibility that what was remarkable wasn't the mountain's praise per se, but simply the human's ability to hear it. Now, of course, a story like this is a slim basis in itself to argue for a realistic interpretation of liturgical references to praise, but it doesn't stand alone. Remembering the importance of the Psalms among liturgical texts, it's interesting what Gregory of Nyssa has to say about the heavens telling the glory of God and the praise offered by all creation in Psalm 148. He talks about the harmonious interaction of the various elements of the universe and the interplay of stability and motion, forming a musical harmony which constitutes a hymn to the power that sustains the universe. Well, again, people might say, yes, this is a literary trope. It's the idea of the music of the spheres. But then he goes on, it seems to me that David must have heard this when through the movement observed in the heavens, filled as it is with skill and wisdom, he listened to them declaring the glory of God who performed this music in them. And again, it was because David had been a hearer of this hymnody. Now, this obviously doesn't give us reliable information as to what the psalmist might or might not have heard. It does make you wonder what Gregory and other people he knew might have heard. So Gregory clearly doesn't think that these psalms are just using poetic imagery. He thinks they're a record of experience accessible to the nous, the spiritual intellect, when it goes beyond the fleshly senses and is raised on high, literally becomes on high. And that, I think, is a very interesting phrase, because it reminds us of something in the Eucharist. In preparation for the anaphora, let us hold our hearts on high. Anos comentas carias. This is how we prepare for the vision of worship, a worship that involves all things. When I was originally started thinking about these things and this material, I came across quite a remarkable account which seemed to confirm the direction of the other evidence was pointing, and that's an account of a vision experienced by Elder Emilianos of Simonopetro, who was one of the prime authors of the contemporary monastic revival on the Holy Mountain, that a nighttime vision at a time of great depression and despondency for him, when he couldn't see any point in monastic life and everything was a burden. And suddenly he's aware of everything filled with light. The stars come down and unite themselves with earth, and everything was praying the Jesus prayer. This happened in his cell, and somehow he didn't even remember how he got himself to the church, but he found himself celebrating the liturgy, and as he says, the light moved from his surroundings to his heart. The liturgy ended, but the song that had begun in his heart was endless, and he saw that heaven and earth sing this prayer without ceasing. And the monk truly lives only when he's animated by it. This story is recounted, it's also mentioned pseudonymously in the elder's own writings. It's recounted by Father Maximos Konstas, who's one of the monks at Simonopetro, and he connects it with the elder's own comments on Psalms 18 and 150, and the mystical speeches and words that fill the world, so that you hear a single voice that speaks about God. So this gives a very clear picture of the congruence of the direct experience of a contemporary writer, insights from church fathers many centuries ago, and the ancient and continuing experience of the church embedded in the liturgy, in the Psalms and Eucharistic liturgy and elsewhere. Father Maximos Konstas comments on what he calls the deeply ecclesial character of this vision. It's not a private mystical experience. It starts off, as it were, in private in the cell, and then it opens out into the divine liturgy. It bears a direct relation to the worship of the whole church. He describes it as a kind of matin service in which creation literally responds to the call of the psalmist in the Lord's Psalms. One could also say that there's a sense in which matins and other services set out as a matter of public record the hidden reality of the created order, which only a few experience at first hand. So what more does liturgical worship tell us about this reality? Well, for one thing, it reveals the context of our own worship. This is a consistent theme that keeps recurring, the three estates of worshippers, we might say, the angelic powers, things visible, and us. We see this in anaphora prayers and other prayers, ancient and modern. It's a tripartite choir, we might say. We've seen the stars regularly are described in those terms as a choir. The ancient inclusion of both of these non-human estates in anaphora prayers is significant. As we've said, the anaphora is the point at which we are exhorted to raise our hearts on high, to aspire to the state in which one perceives this cosmic worship. So the anaphora prayer is speaking of the reality perceived in this state, the context of our own thanks and praise, but a context which normally we're not aware of. And one element of this draws certainly on a vision, on the vision of Isaiah, and also the vision of Ezekiel, the four creatures, which we'll come to in a moment. I notice incidentally in the hall there's a very fine image of that from the Book of Kells with the four creatures. One of the early anaphoras, unfortunately no longer, or only very occasionally used, that has this cosmic picture is that of St. James, and Cyril of Jerusalem seems to be referring to a similar tradition when he says, after this we commemorate heaven and earth and sea, the sun and moons, the stars, all creation, rational and irrational. And then after that he talks about the angels. In effect, he says, saying in David's words, magnify the Lord with me. Is rather disappointing that the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom seems to be the one in which the visible part of this choir has dropped out entirely. Although it's interesting, there's a variant, one manuscript in the commentary on the liturgy by Germanos of Constantinople, where he says the people take up the thrice holy hymn not only in place of the seraphim, but also the creatures with four faces, again associated with the vision of the whole of visible creation. I was always rather sceptical, and my husband insisted that his first encounters with a liturgy in English, which was at conferences of the Fellowship of St. Albans and Sergius, they used a text which had the cherubim and the seraphim shrieking, roaring, bellowing and saying, which does certainly sound a little odd, but in fact, if you think of it, that is precisely corresponding to the four beasts, the shrieking eagle, the roaring lion, the bellowing ox and the speaking man. And this, again, is the praise from all creation present at the heart of the liturgy. Somebody in writing this commentary thought that this omission of the visible world needed to be rectified. Does the visible creation fare any better in the liturgy of St. Basil? Well, very muted compared to James or Cyril, but it is present in a certain form. Quite laconically, Basil says, all things are your servants. Might seem an altogether more humdrum statement, but as we heard this morning, service has more than one meaning. It's liturgical service as well as doing the drudgery. And it does indeed appear, against the backdrop of every creature of reason and understanding worshipping and glorifying, praise from angels and archangels and so forth, it appears that in Basil, all things are your servants, is indeed expressing the same idea. And this connection between service and worship is slightly elaborated in the Alexandrian liturgy attributed to St. Gregory the Theologian. Things visible worship thee, all of them fulfilling thy word. The long prayer for the blessing of waters, great art thou, actually attributed in some manuscripts to Basil, although more usually to Sophronius of Jerusalem, teacher of St. Maximus, is in many ways anaphora-like in its references to creation, and that includes a passage, the sun sings thy praises, the moon glorifies thee, the stars supplicate before thee, the light obeys thee, the deeps are afraid at thy presence, the fountains are thy servants. Praise and worship on the part of the visible creation isn't an activity distinct from faithfully doing what it was created to do. It's, if you like, a more profound understanding of what this amounts to. And just to pause a moment on that passage from the Blessing of Waters prayers, first of all, the language of visible creation as servants, like that of creation's worshippers, puts it on a level with us. Other creatures serve our needs, but they do so by God's grace. They are ultimately his servants, not ours. And one might recall what Chrysostom says about Psalm 148, noting just how much space is devoted to natural phenomena that are inconvenient to us, fire and hail and so forth. And of course, the idea of creation, visible creation as God's servants, carries an obviously anti-pagan message that the awe and veneration, which are a natural response to such phenomena and the power they have, should be directed to their maker and not to the creatures themselves, because the problem with paganism is not by any means the recognition that material creation has a spiritual dimension. It's the idea that that spiritual dimension is innate to the creatures themselves and points to them rather than allowing them to point beyond themselves. In speaking of the three estates of creatures praising the Lord that I mentioned, one thing to note is that the order they usually come follows the sequence of creation: the bodiless powers, visible things, and then humans. And that suggests that when we call on all creation to join us in praising the Lord, yes, we're expressing a joy that exceeds our own capacity to articulate, but we're not teaching other creatures to do something novel to them. We're more acknowledging that we're now working with them in recognizing our common creator, rather than trying to go against them and him. And a very good example of this is the way the Song of the Three Children is used on Holy Saturday. Historically, it was sung at the moment when the newly baptized would come into the church. In other words, this is the latest group of humans rejoining the choir of creatures who praise the Lord and exalt him forever, because unlike the other creatures, humans are capable of not doing so. So this gives us some indication of what it means to talk about creation as worshipping the Lord, the words of creation praising the Lord. But we might still wonder whether, how far this is at least mediated through humans, even if it's not just our imagination. Or to put it another way, do creation's words have an existence apart from a human observer? Chrysostom points out that, again, this is apropos of Psalm 148, there are three ways in which creatures can be said to glorify God: through words, through appearance, or through life and action. Obviously, humans can perform the first and the third through words and actions. Visible creation, he says, uses the second method. It tells God's glory through its beauty and vastness and its usefulness, and these qualities lead the observer to praise and bless its maker. But St. Basil goes a bit further and says, this wisdom we perceive in creation calls silently upon its creator and Lord, so that you may ascend to insight concerning him who alone is wise. This is going to be an insight also into bringing a new vision of the practical wisdom in things, the wisdom in the way that things have been ordained to work together. There is something we should be learning from rather than simply being inspired by. So, to conclude, there are more things I could talk about, but I don't want to. Could come back to those. I do think that in the liturgical text we're affirming an inward reality to visible things, which only a few of our Holy Fathers and Mothers experience directly, though very likely it's rather more of them than we realise. But the liturgy, the Eucharistic liturgy particularly, but not only, gives us the possibility of growing into that experience so that it becomes our own. Another pretty prominent contemporary Athonite father, Archimandrite Vasilios of Iveron, puts this very well, I think, when he says that liturgical experience teaches us an inner vision of the world. And he emphasizes this is not some sort of extraordinary supernatural state. It's an apprehension of the basic unity between the initial origin, creation by God, the present-day organization and the eschatological reality of all things, which is God who is the cause of all. The present-day organization, I think that's important, because that is the ordinary, perhaps ordinary in inverted commas, working of nature that we see round us, whether it's at the visible level, whether it's at the micro or the macro level. The world that is accessible to science, if you like, is all part of this basic unity. This is the world that is praising God and exalting him above all forever. And so it's that inner vision that enables us to hold together with the transformation of all matter into Christ, the work of microorganisms and decomposing stars, and indeed the whole range of interconnections that are described by ecological science. This is something very relevant to the way we look practically at our environment. And we're talking here about an awareness of the Godwoodness of all things, an ability to perceive their service, their everyday activity, as a hymn of praise. And Father Vasilios also, like Zizoulas we saw earlier, takes up this hymn at the end of the liturgy, "We have seen the true light." And he says, we have seen the true light reflected from the whole of the transfigured world. And the transfigured world is the world around us, but perceived differently. And this, I believe, throws light, and I use the term advisedly, on a point that St. Maximus makes. I apologize for not writing this down, it comes in the Mystagogy again, about the analogy between the visible and the invisible creation. That it's not just that we can and should perceive things invisible through the visible world, as Paul says in Romans 1:20. There is also a spiritual understanding, spiritual knowledge and understanding of visible things through the invisible, through the experience of the invisible world and the invisible dimension, the secret life of the visible world. We start seeing visible things in a different way. The heavens really are telling the glory of God. It's not something we read into nature. It's a truth that we proclaim liturgically, and that's the first step towards perceiving it in everything we touch. So thank you.
Response, I'm sorry I didn't clap, I was busy writing down another point.
Yeah, well, I wasn't looking.
By this time of the day, it's not always easy to remember them. First of all, it's not easy to respond to a paper that's got so much in it. So, if you will forgive me, I will just give you things that sparked off in my mind. First of all, when you picked up again my picture of looking at the creation with, and we should all be looking in the same direction, not standing with our backs to the light. That, of course, is what I find instinctively wrong with nave altars, which are so fashionable. I mean, they're a liturgical abomination. Because what you get the Holy of Holies now used to stack the spare chairs, or the place where have I done something dreadful? Or the place where the Sunday school is told to go and do its colouring while the real people get on with worship. So nave altars, that was the first thing that came into my mind. The point you made about the world as the church, and then of course the world as the temple, that is a direct thing coming through, which is one of those occasions where I had both those things in my head, but I'd never linked them before. Which is, is so easy to do. And the cosmic liturgy. Another thing that came into my mind was, and I don't know your liturgy, but one of these so-called puzzles about the Western Eucharistic prayers is why the Sanctus is embedded in them. Now, I think if you think of the covenant that is renewed at the Last Supper as the cosmic covenant, or that's what the modern trendy name is for the eternal covenant, the creation covenant. If you think of that as what is renewed at the Last Supper, which it undoubtedly is if you read Matthew's account, then the Sanctus and seeing the whole world full of the glory is perfectly obvious, belongs there. But if you think of it as some way kind of superseding the Moses covenant and all the problem that makes with our Jewish brothers and sisters, then of course the Sanctus doesn't fit. But if you're working with the right covenant, it fits seamlessly. Now, another thing that came to mind, and I can't remember the detail of this, Cardinal Newman, in one of his many, many sermons, has a lovely one about the invisible powers. Some of you may remember it. And it's definitely called the invisible powers, and it was exactly on what you were saying, but I cannot remember. There's 29 volumes or something of these things. They used to be on the open shelves in the university library, but they're now, and you have to know which volume you want, or else ask for all of them, and they bring them down to you on a trolley, which is not the easiest way. But I'm sure you can find it online. And that's a very, very good, his reflection on what was happening with the scientific revolution in the middle of the 19th century. And he was trying to say, yes, but what about the angels? Then another thing that came into my mind when you were talking about all creation praising, there is a passage in the Quran, and again, I don't know the Quran as well as I should, which says something like, if you destroy a creature, you are diminishing the praise of God. As somebody may be able to give me that reference. I can't remember exactly where it's from. But there is a lovely biblical piece that you kind of put in under the bottom of this. In Revelation chapter 4, where you have the Revelation chapter 5, where you have the vision of worship in heaven, and it is thought, this is the end of Revelation 5, from verse 9 following, they sang a new song. Now you can't distinguish between new and renew in Hebrew, it's the same. And so if you are singing a song in this context, you are actually singing a renewing song. So your song renews the creation, okay? Now this is doing the dangerous job of translating back into a supposed Hebrew underlying the book of Revelation, which I'm sure it does, but any purist will say, oh, you can't be sure. Well, I'm going to put my head above the parapet on that one. But then it goes on. Then I looked and I heard around the throne the living creatures, the elders, the voice of many angels, numbering myriads of myriads, thousands of thousands. And I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea and all therein, saying to him who sits upon the great Gloria. So this is a picture of the cosmic worship that renews the creation following upon that, worthy art thou who was slain, and by thy blood didst ransom men for God. Again, it's a problem of translation, because that's ransom word is the atonement word. Has made them a kingdom and priests to our God. That's the high priesthood. And then everything, you've got this cosmic worship, which I think is hugely important and ties in with, I knew about 3 of these, which is not bad for a Methodist, but I'm very grateful for the others. Now, 2 other things which might be relevant to this. One of the things I didn't say this morning is that the veil of the temple, which shields or screens the eyes of the material world from the glory of God, this veil is woven of 4 different coloured threads, which, according to both Philo and Josephus, represent the 4 elements. In other words, the 4 elements, the red is fire, the blue is air, the purple is the water because of the seashell, and the white is linen. And these woven together represent matter, any matter of the creation. And when the creation is transfigured, what we are doing is seeing through the veil to the uncreated light beyond. And when that shines through, and well, you know the rest of that, but there is a lovely piece of symbolism in the textiles of the temple. There is a huge amount in simply the humble business of weaving in the temple. And the temple veil is made of these 4 colours that represent the creation. When the high priest, or in the time of the kings, almost certainly the Melchizedek priesthood, or the royal priesthood, when they were given their sort of vestments of office, if you like, they were given this curious garment called an ephod. And an ephod just means something you tie on, so we've got no idea what it was. And this was made of the same fabric as the veil, but the fabric was woven through with gold, which is a symbol of wisdom. And the teaching of the high priest was to weave the gold of divine wisdom through the fabric of creation. Simple, and all done with a little vestment. Now, this thing, they made a great thing that this was tied on, and they used to pun the Hebrew words for an ornament and a yoke, as in yoke of oxen. He put this on and he became the servant. So that ties in with that. And you may have heard a Christmas reading that said the government will be upon his shoulder. There you are. That's what he was doing. He was wearing his vestment, which showed that his job was to weave the light of the divine wisdom through the fabric of creation, which is your transfiguration. So those are my thoughts. And now, actually I've got 1 or 2 others scribbled on a second sheet. Are you aware of a rather curious text called the Testament of Adam? Have you come across it? It's in 3 separate parts. It's an early Christian anthology of possibly, well, part of it is Jewish, some of it is certainly Christian, and it was adopted by the Christians. And the first part of the Testament of Adam is all about all the different hours, and this is the Jewish part, in which various bits of creation have their turn to praise. So, you know, it's a certain hour for everything. And the last bit is very interesting. It's about the gifts. This is irrelevant to our immediate topic. It's about the gifts which the angels gave to Adam when he was thrown out of the Garden of Eden. And these were the 3 things that we recognise in another context. They were gold, frankincense and myrrh. And yes, indeed, they were the symbols of the original priesthood. Frankincense, because the high priest's hands were filled with frankincense when he was consecrated, and that was to offer the prayers. Myrrh was the myrrh oil with which he was anointed, and that transformed him into a holy one. That's wordplay. And gold was the gold of divine wisdom. So when you sing We Three Kings of Orient are, those explanations which we have are traditional and all the rest of it, but they're not the originals, and the originals point to something much more interesting.